She sits down on the edge of a chenille bedspread, the heavy clatter of the school bus already fading down the street. It is 1956, and the air in her bedroom smells sharply of Noxzema and setting lotion. Before she even thinks about opening her geometry textbook, her fingers are already moving. What those after-school hours actually looked like is the story nobody filmed. The post-war years handed American families something they had not had in a generation: actual breathing room. The men came home from the war, the factories shifted back to consumer goods, and suddenly there were new houses in new subdivisions with new appliances humming in the kitchens. For the first time, a teenage girl might have an hour in the afternoon that was not spoken for by a war effort or a family in crisis. But do not mistake that hour for freedom. It was simply a different kind of structured. What I do on this channel is rescue the parts of the past that did not make it into the history books or the television specials. The daily rituals, the unspoken household rules, the small ceremonies that real women and girls moved through without anyone writing them down. The 1950s teenage girl is almost always shown to us through the lens of a sock hop or a soda fountain. What I want to show you today is the Tuesday afternoon nobody put in the movie, because that Tuesday afternoon is where the real story lives. The very first thing that happened when a 1950s teenage girl walked through the front door was not a snack, not a phone call, and certainly not sitting down in front of the television. It was changing her clothes. This was not a rule anyone posted on the refrigerator. Nobody handed her a printed schedule. It was simply understood, absorbed the way all the most powerful household rules were absorbed, by watching her mother do the same thing, and her mother before that. The school clothes came off. Full stop. What she changed into had its own name and its own logic: play clothes. That phrase meant something very specific in the 1950s household. Pedal pushers, which were cropped trousers that hit just below the knee, were the workhorse of the after-school wardrobe. Dungarees, which we would call jeans today, were acceptable at home, but would never have appeared at school. Older cotton house dresses that had seen better days also made the rotation. The point was simple. These were the clothes you could actually move in, work in, and get dirty in without consequence. To understand why this rule mattered so deeply, you have to understand what a 1950s school wardrobe actually looked like. Most teenage girls owned somewhere between 3 and 5 school outfits total. A new dress was not a casual purchase. It represented a real portion of the family budget, chosen carefully, sewn at home or bought on layaway, and expected to last an entire school year. Spilling something on it, snagging it on a cabinet hinge, or fading it with repeated wear before its time was a genuine household problem. Protecting those garments was protecting the family's investment. There is something almost choreographic about the way this rule operated inside a 1950s home. The front door opened. The school bag hit a specific spot near the stairs, and the girl moved directly to the bedroom without being told. Her mother might be in the kitchen and never say a word. The shoes came off in a particular order. The dress was hung, not dropped. The play clothes went on with the same care the school clothes came off with. It was a silent choreography, passed down not through instruction but through daily observation, and every girl in the house knew every step. Once the play clothes were on, the afternoon opened up in front of her. But it did not open freely. It unfolded in a sequence, and that sequence had a logic to it that was as reliable as the school bell that had ended her day an hour earlier. There was an order of operations to a 1950s teenage girl's afternoon, and understanding that order is the key to understanding who she actually was and what her daily life actually required of her. The afternoon was not random. It was structured, and the first item on the unspoken list was not homework. In the silent hierarchy of a 1950s daughter's obligations, homework sat somewhere in the middle of the list, not at the top. The home came first. This was not cruelty, and it was not neglect. It was the operating assumption of the era, absorbed so completely that most girls of the time would not have thought to question it. The household had needs that ran on a schedule, and that schedule did not pause for algebra. Dinner had to be started. Certain chores had to be completed. The daughter's hands were part of the household's daily machinery, and they were expected to be useful before they were expected to be educated. The kitchen tasks assigned to teenage daughters in the 1950s were specific and recurring. Peeling potatoes was nearly universal, a daily task in homes where a hot, starchy dinner was expected on the table by 6. Snapping peas, shucking corn in season, slicing onions, scrubbing carrots. These were the small preparatory jobs that freed the mother to manage the actual cooking while the daughter handled the prep. It was a real division of kitchen labor, and it happened every single weekday afternoon in millions of American homes, quietly and without ceremony, because it simply had to happen. While her hands worked through the kitchen prep, something else was happening in the background. The radio. In the years before television colonized every room in the house, the kitchen radio was a constant presence in the late afternoon, and teenage girls were expert at working alongside it. A favorite program, a news broadcast, or the emerging sounds of early rock and roll on a local station filled the kitchen while the potatoes piled up in the pot. She was multitasking before anyone had invented that word, her hands busy with one task while her mind tracked something else entirely. I want to be careful here, not to paint this kitchen hour as pure drudgery, because the women who lived it often describe it differently. There was a rhythm to working alongside your mother in the late afternoon, a kind of quiet companionship that did not require conversation. The mother knew what needed doing, and the daughter fell into step beside her. Information passed sideways in those kitchens, not in formal lessons, but in the texture of daily proximity. How to test whether oil was hot enough, how to know when the onions had gone far enough. These were things you learned by standing close to someone who already knew them. Here is where I want to address something directly, because the popular image of the 1950s teenager is so persistent and so specific that it can crowd out everything else. The sock hop, the diner booth, the milkshake with 2 straws, the hot rod idling in the parking lot. Those things existed, but they were weekend events, Friday night treats, Saturday afternoon outings. A Tuesday afternoon in 1956 looked nothing like a scene from Greece. The weekday afternoon belonged to the home, and the home had a full agenda that did not include cruising down Main Street. Grease was released in 1978. Happy Days ran from 1974 to 1984. Both were nostalgic productions made by people looking backward through a very particular filter, one that emphasized the fun, the rebellion, and the romance while quietly editing out the ironing, the potato peeling, and the 2 hours of pin curls. That editing was not malicious. It was simply what nostalgia does. It keeps the parts that feel like a party and leaves out the parts that feel like work. But the work is where the real texture of those lives lived. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, and it was not how to do the hand jive. Let me tell you about the ironing board. In a 1950s teenage girl's bedroom, the ironing board was not a piece of equipment that got folded up and shoved in a closet between uses. It was a fixture. It lived in the room the way a desk lives in a room today, and the afternoon ironing session was as regular and as expected as anything else on the unspoken afternoon schedule. She was not ironing because someone stood over her and told her to. She was ironing because unwrinkled school clothes for the next morning were simply a given, and she was the one responsible for producing them. The reason ironing consumed so much time in the 1950s comes down to fabric. Synthetic fibers like polyester and permanent press cotton were not yet dominant in the American wardrobe. The clothes of the early and mid-1950s were primarily cotton, and cotton wrinkles aggressively. A cotton school dress pulled from the closet without pressing looked like it had been slept in. Beyond the dress itself, the crinoline petticoat underneath required its own attention, heavy starching to hold its shape and give the skirt its characteristic full silhouette. Starching and pressing a single outfit could take 20 minutes on its own. The ritual itself had a specific sequence that most girls followed without variation. First, the ironing board came out, and the iron was plugged in to heat. The temperature dial had to be set correctly for cotton, which ran hot, and you learned through experience exactly where that dial needed to sit. Then the record player. A 45 RPM single dropped onto the spindle. The needle lowered, and the music started. Only then did the first piece of clothing come off the hanger. The sequence mattered. The music was not background noise. It was part of the structure of the hour, the thing that made the labor feel like something other than labor. The music that filled those bedrooms during the ironing hour was the soundtrack of a generation in transition. The Platters were a constant presence, their smooth harmonies filling the room with a warmth that made even a stack of wrinkled blouses feel manageable. Buddy Holly brought something sharper and more electric, a sound that felt genuinely new in a way that was almost disorienting if you had grown up with your parents' big band records. Little Richard, Fats Domino, the Everly Brothers. These were not just songs. They were the first signal that the world outside that bedroom was changing, even if the bedroom itself still ran on the old schedule. There is a quality to repetitive physical work that is difficult to describe until you have experienced it. The iron moves across the fabric in long, deliberate strokes. The steam rises. The wrinkle disappears. You lift the garment, check the collar, lay it flat again, and move to the next section. It is not exciting, but it is deeply satisfying in a way that is almost meditative, a complete engagement of the hands that allows the mind to drift along with the music without anxiety about what it should be doing instead. The 1950s teenage girl ironing her school clothes on a Tuesday afternoon was not suffering. She was, in a very real sense, settled. When the last blouse was pressed and hung, the ironing board folded away, and the record came to its end, the afternoon shifted into its next phase. The vanity table. If the kitchen and the ironing board represented the girl's obligations to the household, the vanity table represented something that belonged more entirely to her. This was where she transitioned from daughter as helper to girl becoming herself, and the rituals she performed there were as precise and as serious as anything she had done in the kitchen. The grooming hour was not frivolous. It was a ceremony with its own rules and its own logic. Here is something that tends to surprise people when they first hear it. By 1959, American teenagers as a group were spending $10 billion a year. Not their parents, them. For the first time in history, teenage girls had allowances earmarked specifically for their own wants, their own rituals, their own sense of who they were becoming. That number is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changed everything about what a Tuesday afternoon could look like. So what did a teenage girl actually spend that money on? Not the things the movies suggest. She was buying Pond's cold cream in its heavy glass jar, the kind that sat on the vanity table and caught the afternoon light. She was buying the latest issue of 17 magazine, which arrived with the authority of a textbook in her household. And she was buying 45 RPM records, one at a time, each one a small, deliberate purchase that felt enormous. These were not frivolous choices. They were the building blocks of a private world she was constructing for herself, one afternoon at a time. The vanity table itself deserves a full description, because it was a specific and deliberate space. It was usually a small wooden table with a hinged mirror, sometimes with a matching bench covered in fabric that the girl or her mother had sewn. On its surface sat heavy glass jars with chrome lids, a powder puff in a round box, a small bottle of setting lotion, a row of bobby pins lined up with quiet precision. The whole surface smelled of cold cream and something faintly floral, and it was the one corner of the bedroom that belonged entirely to her. The first thing she reached for, before anything else, was the cold cream. Pond's was the name most households trusted, and the ritual was straightforward and unhurried. A small scoop from the jar, worked across the face in slow circular motions, then wiped away with a soft cloth or a piece of cotton. It removed the day, quite literally. The school day with its chalk dust and cafeteria smells, and the particular exhaustion of being a teenager in public, came away with it. It was not a complicated step, but it was a necessary one, and every girl who did it understood exactly why. After the cold cream came Noxzema. If you have ever opened a jar of it, you know the smell immediately, that sharp, cool, medicinal tingle that hits the back of the nose before the product even touches the skin. For a 1950s teenager, that smell was as familiar as breakfast. It was applied after cleansing, patted across the forehead and chin and cheeks, and it signaled something specific. The school day was categorically over. Teen magazines of the era marketed Noxzema with confident, cheerful language about clear skin and fresh starts. And girls believed it, because the ritual around it felt true even when the claims were not scientifically verified. It is worth pausing here to look honestly at how these products were sold, because the marketing of the 1950s operated with a confidence that outpaced the actual science by a considerable distance. Teen magazines of the era presented skincare products as near-medical solutions, using language that implied clinical authority while offering none of the evidence behind it. Noxzema, Pond's, and dozens of competing brands were marketed with the assurance of a prescription, and teenage girls absorbed those messages alongside their geometry lessons. The products were part of a commercial ecosystem that understood, perhaps for the first time, that teenage girls were a market worth speaking to directly. And some of what that era pushed went well beyond cold cream. Teen magazines of the 1950s also marketed unregulated indoor sun lamps, which girls were encouraged to sit before in order to dry out blemishes. Harsh sulfur soaps were sold in drugstores alongside highly abrasive preparations that teen publications described in cheerful, reassuring terms. These were not fringe products. They were mainstream, advertised in the same pages as prom dress patterns and sock hop advice. By the standards of modern dermatology and safety regulation, these were genuinely dangerous practices, and it is important to name that plainly rather than gloss over it. This is the part of the story that requires documentary distance, and this channel takes that seriously. What teen magazines marketed in the 1950s reflected the beliefs and the commercial incentives of their moment, not verified medical knowledge. The sun lamps were later found to carry real UV risks. The harsh chemical preparations were eventually abandoned as understanding of skin health improved. None of what was marketed then should be read as an endorsement now, and none of it should be tried at home. What matters for our purposes is the cultural texture. Why girls believed it, how it was sold to them, and what it tells us about the era's relationship with the female body and beauty. What Noxzema actually gave a teenage girl in 1956 had less to do with chemistry and more to do with ceremony. That sharp, cool tingle was a signal her nervous system recognized. It said, "School is behind you, the afternoon belongs to you, and something deliberate is beginning." The vanity table ritual, cold cream first, and then the blue jar, and then the careful assessment in the mirror, was a closing ceremony for the public self and an opening ceremony for the private one. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody said out loud, and this was one of its quieter rooms. It vanished, but it worked, not as a medical claim, but as a human one. The ritual of sitting down at a specific surface, in a specific order, doing something deliberate with your hands and your attention, at the same time every afternoon, was a form of self-possession that the 1950s teenage girl practiced without anyone calling it that. She did not have a word for nervous system regulation or intentional transition. She just knew that the afternoon felt different after the vanity table than it had before it, and that was enough reason to keep doing it every single day. From the vanity table, the afternoon moved to the mirror for an entirely different reason. Hair setting was not a weekend project or an occasional preparation. It was a daily, weekday commitment that consumed 1 to 2 hours of every single afternoon, and it was non-negotiable if a girl wanted to appear at school the next morning looking the way the era demanded. The bouncy, structured hairstyles of the 1950s did not happen by accident or by luck. They happened because someone sat down the afternoon before and did the work, patiently and methodically, curl by curl. The mathematics of it are genuinely striking. A standard 1950s mid-length hairstyle required between 40 and 60 individual pin curls. Not a rough estimate, not a flexible number. 40 to 60 deliberate, precisely placed curls, each one sectioned, twisted, and locked flat against the scalp with a cold metal pin. Girls learned the count the way they learned multiplication tables, through repetition and correction, until the hands knew the work without the mind having to direct every step. It was technical knowledge passed between sisters and mothers and friends, and it lived entirely in the fingers. The technique itself had a specific, repeatable logic. A 1-inch section of hair was combed smooth, then wound tightly around the finger in a flat spiral, then slid carefully off the finger and pressed flat against the scalp. The bobby pin went in at an angle, crossing over the center of the curl to hold it without slipping. Done correctly, the curl sat perfectly flat and would not shift during sleep. Done incorrectly, the morning would reveal a frizzy, uneven disaster that no amount of brushing could fully rescue. Girls learned the difference quickly, and they learned it from watching, not from reading. Before any curl was pinned, setting lotion went on. It came in small bottles and smelled faintly sweet and chemical at once, a scent that anyone who grew up in a household with older sisters or a beauty-conscious mother would recognize immediately. The lotion was worked through damp, freshly washed hair section by section, giving each curl the tension and hold it needed to survive a night of sleep and emerge shaped and springy the next morning. The texture of it on the fingers, slightly sticky, slightly cool, was part of the sensory vocabulary of the 1950s teenage afternoon in a way that is almost impossible to fully describe to someone who never experienced it. The timing of all of this was not arbitrary. Hair had to be set in the afternoon precisely because it needed hours to dry completely before morning. Wet or damp curls that had not fully dried would fall flat within an hour of being released, and no amount of hairspray, which was itself a relatively new product in the 1950s, could save a curl that had not dried properly while pinned. This meant that a girl who forgot to set her hair on Monday afternoon was facing a genuinely difficult Tuesday morning. And the social stakes of appearing at school with flat, unstyled hair were real and felt keenly. And then came the night. The overnight reality of 1950s beauty is something that the glossy photographs of the era never showed. Sleeping on rigid wire rollers or cold metal bobby pins pressed flat against the scalp was not comfortable. Girls shifted carefully, trying to find a position that allowed rest without disturbing the set. Some wore sleeping caps or tied scarves over the curls to protect them. Some slept on their backs with deliberate stillness. The morning result, that perfect, bouncy, effortless-looking wave, was the product of genuine physical endurance the night before. And nobody in the magazines mentioned that part. This is the misconception worth addressing directly, because it shapes how we understand the entire era. The bouncy, pristine 1950s hairstyle was not a natural gift. It was not something girls simply woke up with because their hair happened to behave. It was the result of 40 to 60 pin curls set every single weekday afternoon, left to dry through the evening, slept on through the night, and carefully released and brushed into shape the next morning. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, that the appearance of effortlessness is almost always the product of invisible, daily, disciplined labor. Picture her for a moment, sitting at the mirror in the late afternoon, the light shifting from gold to amber as the hour moved toward 5 o'clock. Her fingers work through the sections automatically now, the count running in the back of her mind the way a familiar song does. Beside the mirror, propped open to a page she has already read twice, is the latest issue of 17 magazine. The girl on the cover has exactly the kind of hair she is trying to build, curl by curl, on her own head. She is not following instructions in any formal sense. She is translating an image into a technique, and she has been doing it long enough that the translation is nearly fluent. Seventeen magazine, which had launched in 1944, functioned as something far more than a fashion publication in the life of a 1950s teenage girl. It was an instruction manual, a social map, and a mirror all at once. Its pages showed her how to set her hair, how to apply her lipstick, how to behave at a dance, how to write a thank you note, and how to think about the future she was expected to want. Girls read it with the seriousness of a textbook and the pleasure of a novel, and they returned to certain pages the way you return to a recipe you are still learning, checking the details until the knowledge is finally yours. After the vanity table and the pin curls came a shift in the afternoon's texture, from the grooming rituals that prepared the self for tomorrow to the creative work that built something entirely new. Sewing was the next station in the 1950s teenage afternoon, and it was not a hobby in the casual modern sense of the word. It was an economic necessity dressed up in creative pleasure, and for a teenager who wanted to look fashionable without a department store budget, it was the only real path available. The connection between what she saw in a magazine on Tuesday and what she wore to the sock hop on Friday ran directly through her own hands. Sewing was not a quaint hobby for 1950s teenage girls. It was a genuine economic strategy. Department store dresses cost anywhere from $3 to $8 in an era when a teenager's weekly allowance might be 50 cents to $1. If a girl wanted to wear something new to the sock hop on Friday, she had to make it herself. Simplicity and butterick patterns brought that possibility within reach, turning a few yards of cotton and an afternoon of careful work into something she could actually wear with pride. The timeline was astonishing by any standard. A girl might flip through the pages of 17 magazine on a Tuesday afternoon, spot a dress she had to have, and by Wednesday she was at the fabric counter of the Five and Dime, running her fingers along bolts of broadcloth and eyeing the pattern rack. Thursday and Friday afternoons were spent cutting, pinning, and stitching at the machine. By Friday evening, she was pressing the finished seams with a hot iron and hanging the dress on a wire hanger ready for the weekend. Magazine to wearable garment in 4 days. That was not unusual. That was the rhythm. Christian Dior's new look had swept the fashion world in 1947, with its nipped waists and full sweeping skirts, and by the mid-1950s that silhouette had filtered all the way down to the teenage bedroom sewing corner. Simplicity pattern number after number offered teen-sized versions of those structured bodices and voluminous skirts. Girls were not simply copying fashion. They were interpreting it, scaling it, making it work with 3 yards of polished cotton and a borrowed zipper foot. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew how to read a pattern the way a musician reads sheet music, translating flat paper into something that moved. Close your eyes for a moment and try to inhabit that sewing corner. The tissue paper pattern pieces whisper and crinkle as she smooths them flat. There is the sharp metallic smell of the scissors, the faint waxy scent of tailor's chalk marking the seam lines. The sewing machine hums at a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, punctuated by the click of the presser foot dropping. Straight pins catch the afternoon light and scatter tiny sparks across the fabric. It was a sensory world entirely contained in a corner of a small bedroom, and for an hour or two every afternoon, it was completely hers. Sewing was not always a solitary act. After-school sewing clubs were a genuine feature of 1950s teen social life, and they looked nothing like the diner booths that movies would have you imagine. 3 or 4 girls would gather in someone's living room or bedroom, each working on her own pattern, sharing a pin box and comparing fabric choices. One girl might be hemming a skirt while another was struggling to set a sleeve. They talked, they laughed, they fixed each other's mistakes. It was collaboration disguised as domesticity, and the social bonds it built were real and lasting. What sewing actually taught those girls is worth pausing on, because it goes well beyond the ability to hem a skirt. Reading a pattern required genuine spatial reasoning, the ability to look at a flat, 2-dimensional shape and understand how it would become a 3-dimensional garment once joined. Calculating yardage required arithmetic. Matching plaids across seams demanded precision and patience, and wearing something you built with your own hands, something that fit your specific body because you had adjusted the darts yourself, gave a quiet, unshakable confidence that no store-bought dress could quite replicate. Now we arrive at the ritual that surprises modern viewers the most. Not the ironing, not the pin curls, not even the strict telephone rules. The one that stops people cold when they first hear about it is the hope chest. If you have never encountered this tradition, stay with me for a moment, because understanding it requires setting aside the instinct to judge it immediately, and instead listening to what it actually felt like from the inside for the girls who were living it. A hope chest was, at its most literal, a cedar-lined wooden chest, often given to a girl in her early teens, that she would spend years filling with handmade and collected household items in preparation for her eventual marriage. Cedar was chosen deliberately because it repelled moths and kept linens fresh for years. The chest typically sat at the foot of the bed, which meant it was the first thing a girl saw in the morning and the last thing she saw at night. It was not hidden away. It was present part of the daily landscape of her room, a slow and patient project built one pillowcase at a time. Girls as young as 15 and 16 were actively filling these chests, and the work happened in the after-school hours, often at the kitchen table or in the bedroom, with the radio playing softly. A girl might spend 45 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon embroidering a single pillowcase, working a chain of small blue flowers along the hem with a needle no thicker than a pin. The stitches had to be even, the tension consistent, the pattern transferred carefully from tissue paper. It was slow, deliberate, exacting work, and it was entirely normal for a girl her age to be doing it. The contents of a well-stocked hope chest followed an understood, if unwritten, inventory. Embroidered pillowcases in sets of 4, a hand-hemmed linen tablecloth, a set of hand towels with the girl's future initials stitched in one corner, even if she did not yet know whose last name those initials would represent. Silver-plated spoons collected one at a time, sometimes given as gifts at Christmas or birthdays. Each item was folded with deliberate care and laid flat in the cedar-scented interior. The chest was not just a collection of objects. It was a record of hours spent, a tangible measure of patience and skill. Here is what gets lost when we look at the hope chest only through a modern lens. Many of the girls filling those chests were genuinely proud of what they were building. There was real satisfaction in holding up a finished pillowcase and seeing that the embroidery was neat, the tension even, the corners crisp. These were skills that took months to develop, and the chest was the evidence of that development. The pride was not in the idea of getting married. It was in the making, in the accumulation of something beautiful and lasting, built entirely by her own hands, one quiet afternoon at a time. And here is the nuance that I think matters most, because this channel has never been interested in flattening the past into either a golden age or a cautionary tale. The hope chest ritual existed inside a world of genuinely limited choices for young women, and that is a true and important fact. But reducing the ritual entirely to those limitations erases the real human experience of the girls who lived it. They were not all suffering. Many were creating, practicing, and building with their hands. Holding both of those truths at once, the constraint and the genuine satisfaction, is the only honest way to look at it. After the sewing corner and the vanity table and the hope chest, there was one more ritual that shaped the social life of a 1950s teenager in ways that are almost impossible to imagine today. The telephone. But not the telephone as we know it. The telephone as a shared, public, neighbor-monitored instrument that required strategy, timing, and a very specific kind of discretion just to have a 3-minute conversation with your best friend. Up to 75% of suburban and rural American homes in the 1950s shared what was called a party line, a single telephone line connected to multiple households in the same neighborhood. You did not have your own private line. You shared it with 2, 4, sometimes 6 neighboring families, all of whose phones would ring on the same wire. When you picked up the receiver to make a call, you might find your neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, already mid-conversation with her sister in Cleveland. You would quietly replace the receiver and wait, and while you waited, you hoped she would finish before your mother needed the kitchen. Each household on a party line was assigned its own ring pattern. 2 short rings and 1 long ring meant the call was for your house. 1 long ring meant it was for the Petersons next door. 3 short rings meant the Garcias down the block. A teenage girl had to sit and actually listen to the ring before she could pick up, counting the beats, making sure the call was hers. And even after she answered, she knew that any neighbor could lift their receiver at any moment and hear every word she said. This was not paranoia. It was simply how the system worked. Parents enforced strict time limits on telephone calls, typically 3 to 5 minutes per conversation. This was not arbitrary cruelty. The party line meant that an extended teenage conversation was genuinely tying up a shared community resource. If a neighbor needed to call a doctor or reach a family member, a teenager chatting for 30 minutes was a real problem, not just a social inconvenience. So the 5-minute limit had a logic to it, and most girls understood that logic even if they found it frustrating. You had 5 minutes. You learned to use them with extraordinary efficiency. Think about what it means to compress an entire social life into 3 to 5 minutes, with the knowledge that a neighbor might be listening. You could not ramble. You could not circle around to the point. You had to know what you needed to say before you picked up the receiver. Girls developed a kind of conversational precision that is genuinely remarkable. The ability to convey friendship, comfort, excitement, and plans in a few compact sentences, then sign off cleanly. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody said out loud, in the things that were communicated in a tone of voice or a carefully chosen word when plain speech was not possible. Picture this specific moment. It is a Wednesday afternoon in 1957. She has been waiting since she got home from school, watching the clock above the stove, doing the dishes, starting the potatoes. Finally, at 4:30, she picks up the receiver and listens. The line is clear. She dials quickly, the rotary clicking through each number with a sound that feels almost too loud. Her best friend answers on the second ring. She cups her hand around the mouthpiece and speaks just above a whisper, one ear always half-tuned to the faint click that would mean someone on the party line had just lifted their own receiver to listen. The party line shaped teen social dynamics in ways that went far beyond simple inconvenience. Because calls were monitored, brief, and shared, girls developed other channels for communication. Notes passed at school carried more weight. A carefully worded letter slipped into a locker on a Monday morning could say things that were impossible to risk on the party line. Coded language developed naturally. Shorthand references that meant something to 2 friends and nothing to a nosy neighbor. The constraint of the party line, rather than silencing teenage social life, actually pushed it toward greater creativity and intimacy in other forms. To really understand the 1950s teen afternoon, you have to understand where it came from. Because the leisure time that allowed for pin curls and hope chests and sewing clubs did not exist a decade earlier. In the 1940s, the word teenager had barely been coined, pushed into use by advertising executives who recognized a new demographic. But for the girls living through World War II, after-school hours had nothing to do with 17 magazine or Pond's cold cream. They were collecting scrap metal, managing rationing books, and working part-time jobs to supplement family income while fathers and brothers were overseas. The post-war afternoon was built on the foundation of that wartime labor. Before any of this existed, there was a different kind of afternoon entirely. In the early 1940s, a teenage girl coming home from school did not change into play clothes and head to the vanity table. She dropped her books and headed straight out the door again, because the neighborhood was running a scrap metal drive and her block had a quota to meet. Aluminum pots, old tires, flattened tin cans. After-school hours belonged to the war effort, and leisure was simply not part of the vocabulary yet. Then the war ended, And something strange happened. The post-war boom of 1950 to 1953 handed American families a new concept they had almost forgotten: time that was not accounted for. But for teenage daughters, that leisure time did not arrive unstructured. Mothers stepped in immediately. The afternoon hours were redirected toward the homemaker arts, learning to iron a man's collar without scorching the placket, starting the roast at the right hour, understanding the invisible timetable of a well-run household. Freedom arrived, but it came with a new curriculum. By 1954, something else arrived to compete with the ironing board and the roast pan. Rock and roll came crackling through the radio speaker, and suddenly the bedroom had a heartbeat. The years between 1954 and 1958 represent what historians of teen culture consider the true peak of the post-war teenage afternoon. Girls were still doing the domestic work, still setting their pin curls, still embroidering pillowcases for the hope chest. But now the Platters were playing while they did it, and the tension between obligation and desire was humming at a frequency nobody had heard before. But nothing that tightly wound stays wound forever. By the early 1960s, the rigid architecture of the post-war teen afternoon began to show its first cracks. The counterculture was not yet a full movement, but the questions were already forming quietly in bedroom mirrors and sewing corners. Why was the hope chest more important than the homework? Why did the ironing come before the algebra? The structured afternoon did not collapse all at once. It loosened, gradually, the way a pin curl loosens in humidity, until one day the shape it had held was simply gone. Here is the thing worth sitting with carefully, because this channel does not deal in simple cautionary tales. When those rituals fractured, some things genuinely worth releasing were released. The limitations on those girls' ambitions were real, and nobody should romanticize the narrowness of the choices available to them. But something else went with the rituals, something that had nothing to do with restriction. The groundedness that came from a structured afternoon, from hands engaged in physical work, from a closing ceremony at the vanity table, that part quietly disappeared too, and we have been noticing its absence ever since. Which brings us to right now, and why any of this matters beyond nostalgia. In 2026, there is a documented and growing cultural conversation about returning to analog, hands-on habits in the evening hours. Researchers and cultural commentators are noting that screen-free, tactile routines, the kind that ask your hands to do something specific and physical, appear to genuinely soothe the nervous system after a day of digital overload. That conversation sounds new. But the 1950s teenage girl was living the answer to it every single afternoon, without ever knowing she was doing something worth studying. The resurgence is showing up in specific ways. Women are returning to hand sewing in the evenings. They are setting their phones down and picking up embroidery hoops. They are making bread by hand on Tuesday nights for no particular reason, except that kneading dough for 10 minutes quiets something inside them that scrolling never does. None of them are calling it a 1950s ritual, but if you placed a photograph of their hands beside a photograph of a teenage girl's hands in 1956, pressing a pin curl flat against her scalp, the posture of concentration would be nearly identical. The addict remembers, even when we forget. Consider the contrast plainly. A modern teenager's after-school hours are largely screen-bound, and the anxiety statistics that have followed are not subtle. The 1950s teenage girl spent her afternoon with her hands in motion, peeling vegetables, pressing a hot iron across cotton, threading a needle through tissue paper, locking a pin curl into place. Each of those tasks required her full, embodied attention. Not passive consumption, but active making. The screen asks nothing of your hands. The ironing board, the sewing corner, the vanity table, they asked everything, and that asking had a cost and a benefit both. There is a real psychology underneath the ritual, and it is worth naming precisely. Repetitive, physical tasks that have a clear beginning and a clear end, setting 45 pin curls, ironing 5 school blouses, hemming a pillowcase, produce what researchers now describe as a state of engaged calm. The hands are occupied, the mind is free to process the day, and the body is doing something that results in a visible, finished thing. The 1950s teenage girl did not have the language for nervous system regulation. But she had the ironing board, and on a difficult Tuesday, that was enough. The attic remembers, even when we forget. That phrase matters here, because what we are talking about is not a set of rules to be reinstated. Nobody is suggesting that teenage girls should be sent back to the ironing board instead of the classroom. What we are honoring is something quieter and more specific, the intelligence embedded in those rituals. The women who built those afternoons, the mothers who passed the choreography down without writing a single word of it, understood something about the relationship between physical work and emotional steadiness that we are only now finding the clinical language to describe. What we can carry forward carefully and honestly is the intentionality, not the restriction, not the narrowed horizon, not the hope chest as a substitute for ambition, but the deliberate structure of the afternoon, the idea that the hours between 3 o'clock and dinner were worth shaping consciously, that a closing ritual at the vanity table was a signal worth giving yourself, that making something with your hands before the day ended was not a waste of time, but the opposite of one. That part of the 1950s afternoon belongs to anyone who wants it, regardless of the decade they happen to be living in. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew. That is the truest thing I can say about the invisible curriculum of the 1950s afternoon. No teacher assigned it. No manual explained the sequence. Change your clothes. Start the potatoes, set the board, heat the iron, sit at the mirror, section the hair, count the curls, close the jar. It was passed through kitchens and bedrooms in the particular silence of women, watching other women and understanding without being told. That transmission is its own kind of intelligence, and it deserves to be named as such before the last person who remembers it is gone. What I want you to take away from this is not a simplified picture. These girls were not living in a golden age, and they were not living in a cautionary tale. They were living in Tuesday afternoons, with cold metal bobby pins in their hands and the platters on the record player and a geometry textbook waiting patiently on the desk. They were doing real labor inside real constraints, and they were also finding real rhythm and real beauty inside those same hours. Both things were true. Honoring their lives means holding both things at once and not flattening them into something easier to explain. If any of this brought back a memory, I would genuinely love to hear it. If your mother or your grandmother had an after-school ritual she never quite explained, a specific order she did things in, a product she kept on her vanity table, a song she ironed to, please leave it in the comments below. Those details are exactly what this channel exists to rescue, and I read every single one. If you are new here, and this felt like coming home a little, the subscribe button is right there, and there is a great deal more waiting for you in the attic. I will see you in the next one.